Our next speaker is Dr. Jacqueline Rivers, who, the wife of Eugene, who spoke yesterday. And Dr. Rivers is the Executive Director of the Seymour Institute on Black Church and Policy Studies, which seeks to create and promote a philosophical, political, and theological framework for a pro-poor, pro-life, pro-family movement within the ecumenical black church, both domestically and internationally. The title of Dr. Rivers' talk is The Black Family. Please welcome Dr. Rivers.
Good morning, everybody. I want to thank Mark Tooley and Jerry McDermott for giving me the opportunity to speak to you on this topic. And I must admit, Mark, I'm among the skeptics of this idea of national covenant, because if a national covenant was established at the original founding, I thought an interesting point was made yesterday by Oswald over dinner, that this was the God of the Enlightenment that these founding fathers conceived of, not necessarily the God whom we talk about today. But in addition to that, when was that national covenant renewed? Certainly, it seemed in the biblical understanding of covenant, the covenant is initiated in a unilateral way by God, but it must be accepted and endorsed by the people who join the covenant. So I very much question whether there's a national covenant. That said, I thought I would talk about this from the perspective of a marriage covenant, which is itself debatable. However, Gordon Hugenberger, in his book, Marriage as a Covenant, defines a covenant as an elected, as opposed to natural, relationship of obligation established under divine sanction. Consonant with his definition, God established marriage and made its mutuality between male and female clear in Genesis 2:24. Jesus reiterates this, the divine sanction, in Mark 10:6-9, when he says, "What God has joined together, let not man put asunder." Marriage is explicitly referred to as a covenant in Malachi 2, verses 14-16, and in Ezekiel 16:8. And John Collins of the University of Chicago concludes that the case for marriage as a covenant is certainly defensible in Malachi, in view of the expression, wife of your covenant, which is a quote from that passage, and the statement that God is a witness to that covenant. However, Collins does not strongly endorse the concept. But what adds to the evidence for marriage working as a covenant is that it's used as a symbol of the Old Testament covenant in Hosea, when the prophet is instructed to marry Gomer as a symbol of Israel's unfaithfulness in her covenant with God. The same symbol is reiterated as the New Testament covenant when Paul uses it as a picture of Christ's relationship with the church in Ephesians 5:31-32. So assuming this idea of marriage as a covenant, let me talk then about the state of the black family. The black family is experiencing astronomical rates of non-marital births. Almost 3 out of every 4 births among black women are to unwed mothers. In 2013, the figure was 71.5%. And that contrasts with 29% among whites. In addition to that, most black children are growing up in father-absent households. In 2014, only 1 in 3, a little better than 1 in 3, black children lived with both parents. The contrasting figure for white children in 2012 was 74%. In addition to that, there's been a sharp decline in marriage among black men between 1970 and 2010, and it was much worse among poor blacks, where it was down to about 40% of them being married in 2010, relative to educated black men, where it was approximately 60%. There are very high rates of childhood poverty. According to the National Poverty Center, poverty rates are highest for families headed by single women, particularly if they're Black or Hispanic. And in 2010, 32% of households headed by single women were poor, compared to 6% of married couple households. Research has shown that children suffer from reduced levels of economic resources in single-parent households relative to those living with married parents, even when transfer payments, so things like earned income tax credits, and taxes are taken into account. Furthermore, the same is true of children living with cohabiting parents. So greater economic benefits accrue to families and children when parents are in a conjugal relationship as opposed to when they're single or cohabiting. As a consequence, in part, of the limited economic resources in these families, children in single-parent households perform less well on standardized tests and have lower grades in school. They suffer more behavioral and psychological problems, and these deficits persist into adulthood. According to a review of the literature by Paul Amato, compared with children who grow up in stable two-parent families, children born outside marriage reach adulthood with less education, they earn less income, have lower occupational status, are more likely to be idle, that is, not employed and not in school, are more likely to have non-marital births among daughters, have more troubled marriages, experience higher rates of divorce, and report more symptoms of depression. So being raised in a single-parent family can have devastating effects for children. Marriage also has positive impacts for men and women. Marriage is associated with substantially higher wages for men. This is a common finding in the research, but one recent study goes on to conclude that marriage is the apparent cause of higher wages. So it's not simply that men who earn more get married, are more likely to be married, but that if you equalize for wages before marriage, then married men actually end up earning more. Married men report less depression than their comparable married pairs. Married women report fewer problems with alcohol. Both men and women are likely to live longer by virtue of being married, even when possible selection effects are taken into account. And married men are less likely to exhibit risky behaviors and more likely to live healthier lifestyles. So the retreat from marriage is extremely costly for Black Americans, and it has been especially devastating for the poor. What's that got to do with the idea of the marriage covenant? Well, there are historians who trace some of this back to slavery. White slaveholders embraced the idolatry of white supremacy, treating their enslaved people as chattel and creating a structure that shredded the marriage covenant among them. Orlando Patterson, a world-renowned sociologist at Harvard, argues that the structure of the Black family was undermined by slavery. First and foremost, legal marriage was not permitted by slaveholders among their slaves. And even common law forms of marriage, created by jumping the broom, was undermined by the institutions. Men were unable to provide for their families because they were totally dependent, almost totally dependent on their masters. They were unable to protect their daughters or their wives from rape, from punishment, from wanton cruelty. In addition to this, these common law marriages were extremely fragile because people were often sold away from their families. And in many cases, men and women actually lived on separate plantations, which then opened up the temptation of sexual infidelity, in particular for men. They were always under the threat of having their family destroyed. Daniel Patrick Moynihan also identified slavery as having a powerful negative effect on marriage among African Americans in his infamous study, the Moynihan Report. Moynihan quotes Nathan Glazier, another famous sociologist from Harvard, who points out that in Brazil, slaves had many more rights than in the United States. The slave could legally marry, he could indeed had to be baptized and become a member of the Catholic Church, and his family could not be broken up for sale. So there's a dramatic difference between the ways in which people were enslaved. Moynihan concluded that these structural constraints on marriage among slaves had a devastating effect on Black families at the time, and along with other structural influences, had lasting effects centuries later. The result was a penchant for female-headed households in which men had little role. Marriage was not tightly associated with childbearing. A more recent work by Edwards in 1996 finds that marriage was denied to slaves as a strategy to limit their civil rights, but that freed people immediately after emancipation embraced marriage, and up to 50% of them are estimated to have been married immediately. However, she points out that they developed their own definition of marriage, which was much more fluid and less long-lasting. It was not permanent in the same way in which marriage was conceived of at the time in that society, because it reflected the influences of slavery. Edwards, however, raises another important point. She recognizes a parallel to the forms of marriage common among poor whites. And in fact, it continues to be true that out-of-wedlock birth rates are much higher among poor women than among the well-off. Almost 70% of all births to women who earned under $10,000 in 2013 were per annum was outside of marriage, compared to only 30% of those earning between $50,000 and $75,000 annually. Almost the same as the rate among Black women. So there's a real confound between race and class here. A confound that actually persists in most of the literature on race, that it is almost impossible to disentangle race and class, because Black people experience concentrated poverty at rates which, according to Rob Sanford, sociologist at Harvard, are unequaled by any other ethnic or racial group. You cannot find a comparison group in any other race given the levels of concentrated poverty that Blacks experience. In addition to this, Blacks face other structural impediments. Access to education, which is the determiner of life chances, which allows one to rise from, to experience social mobility into a higher socioeconomic status, is extremely limited for poor Blacks. It is true that Blacks who made it into the middle class as a result of the civil rights movement and a result of a booming economy in the 1960s continue to have access to education at high levels. But among poor Blacks, it is extremely difficult to access schools which are not extremely poor and in which there's not concentrated poverty as well as high rates of racial segregation, so much so they're referred to as apartheid schools. The work of Alveda and Shapiro documents the difference in wealth between Black and white families. The stark difference that even among middle-class Blacks, wealth is often negative. So if you look at all of the family's debts compared to all of their assets, you end up with their being effectively in debt. And Shapiro goes on in his following study to point out, actually both Alveda and Shapiro in that study called Black Wealth, White Wealth, demonstrate that this is indeed the fruit of racist policies that were implemented in the middle of the 20th century. Redlining, which meant that Black people couldn't get mortgages to buy houses, in addition to things like racial covenants, which did not allow them to buy outside of Black neighborhoods, outside of the ghetto. What then followed was a process in which their property, wherever they were able to buy property in Black neighborhoods, did not appreciate at the same rate at which white property appreciated, creating a wealth deficit which is almost impossible to close. In addition to that, Blacks were not allowed to, didn't have the kind of capital to invest in businesses, so that was another deficit. Shapiro goes on to document that this continues today because white families are in a position to pay in full for a college education, where Black college graduates are coming out drowning in debt. He goes on to demonstrate that in addition to that, white families are in a position to help their children with a down payment on the new house, while black college graduates are in the position not only of having to come up with the down payment and the mortgage to pay for the new house, but in addition to that, they have to help their parents. So instead of money flowing from the older generation to the younger, as it does among whites, among blacks it flows from the younger generation to the older. Continuing structural deficits, which are not simply about cultural practices among blacks. There can be no racial reconciliation till there has been racial justice. Where is the motivation? Where is the motivation to address the structural problems which plague black people? Let me add one other, which is not structural, but cultural. Deva Pager, another sociologist at Harvard. I'm sorry, I'm only quoting Harvard people. I love Kathy Eden's work as well. I love Kathy Eden's work as well, and she's no sociologist at Harvard. Okay, Deborah Page's work shows, and she did this when she was at Princeton, shows that if you take equal resumes and dress young men up, one black, one white, so they both look equally presentable, you send them out with their resumes to employers, and you put on some resumes. Some white resumes say that the man has a prison record, and some says, the same person going to different places but handing out different resumes, right? Some say, I have a prison record, some say I don't. Same thing for black people. The white man with a resume that says he has a prison record gets called back more frequently than the black man whose resume says he doesn't. So there are continuing deficits that black people face. Let's do something about that if we're going to deal with racial reconciliation. I'll just add quickly that what I skipped to talk about structural issues was the fact that America has also undermined the marriage covenant in other important ways. The access to no-fault divorce and contraception, abortion laws have decoupled the link between marriage, sex, and childbearing. So the rug has been pulled out from the idea of a marital covenant. And black people have paid a high price. It's affected us first, but it has spread. The work of Kathy Eden shows that among poor people, poor women, whether you're black, Hispanic, or white, rates of marriage are falling. And the work of Brad Wilcox demonstrates that it's spreading from the poor into the middle classes. So what should we be doing? The way forward. To refer to one of the talks yesterday, white supremacy is a demonic power. We're at a Baptist, at least I believe we're at a Baptist college. So the first thing we should be doing, if this is really a demonic power, where's the church in terms of fasting, prayer, and righteous living so that we can tangle with a demonic power? We can take it on. Because the kind of structural deficits I just described are not going away easily. And if behind it, and it seems convincing to me given how mutable and enduring racism is a demonic power, then the first thing we ought to do is hit our knees. But that's not all we ought to do, because we need to clean up the sex lives of our church leaders, whether they be in the Catholic Church, whether they be in the white evangelical church or in the black church. We can't demonstrate the power of the marriage contract if we don't live it. If people can't see it in our lives, and that's one of the biggest disappointments to me, the failure of the church to demonstrate the power of God. How can we say there's any kind of national covenant if we can't demonstrate the power of God? We need to have greater accountability for our leaders. Brad Wilcox and Nick Wolfinger found in their research that preaching about abstinence and sexual fidelity was related to lower levels of illicit sexual activity. So the other thing we ought to do after the preacher is in a position to actually preach with his life is that he should preach from the pulpit. He should be talking about this more. especially true in black churches. And we need to target the young, because they're the generation that is rejecting this. We need to make our approaches more interesting to young people. We need to use social media and hip hop and videos and all the forms of media that will attract them. And we need to put in place support for marriages, developing, promoting, almost requiring in-depth premarital counseling and increased support for spouses with troubled marriages. We need it across the board, but black people need it even more. We need help holding on to our marriages. But it's really clear from the research that it's not just cultural. Cultural is huge. Even sociologists like Sandy Jenks, who is a dyed-in-the-wool liberal, say that the cultural influences are greater than the structural influences. But we do have to address the structural issues. We have to develop programs that combat the over-incarceration of men, because that's part of what affects black rates of marriage. We need to promote tax and government policies that incentivize marriage. And we need to promote the upper middle class pattern of finishing school, getting a job, getting married, and then having children. And finally, we need the kind of education which supports post-secondary training and not a college degree, because there are jobs going unfilled by Americans in that area, and there are Americans who aren't equipped to fill those jobs. So, thank you very much.